I keep coming back to the paintings of Clarice Beckett. Clarice Beckett was a 20th century artist, the first half of the 20th century, and in many ways she was undiscovered. It was only towards the end of her career and after her death that we began to appreciate the wonder, the beauty and the insight of her paintings. So let me present to you a kind of classic image of a Clarice Beckett painting. There's a famous one called Morning Shadows, and typically there's a simplicity about these paintings, often with a lone figure, and it might be in the morning or at dusk. There's very little detail, but the use of shadow, of light, it draws you in. There's a simplicity that, as I said, there's often a single figure there, and somehow you feel you're in the painting. You're that single figure. You're the figure making the journey down the pathway towards the beach or up from the beach. And you're by yourself. You're stripped bare of everything. So on the surface, the paintings are bleak, not ugly, but sparse. But always the use of light, of shade, of suggestion, of perspective means that the bleakness, the experience of being stripped bare doesn't have the final say. I'm not saying that it prefigures some kind of triumphal result, but the honesty of the painting, the identification we have with that lone figure of being stripped bare, whilst it reflects with incredible integrity the human situation, there is this glimmer that the present situation does not have the final say. Today is Good Friday, and incredibly important tradition within the Christian church. And over the years we've heard everything about Good Friday. Sometimes we hear maudlin, even ghoulish reflections on this. I want us to reflect today on the significance of the cross, partly from the perspective of a Clarice Beckett painting, that if the cross is to be a pertinent symbol, a symbol that is meaningful, then we have to, like a Clarice Beckett painting, we have to strip it bare. To begin that process, I'd like us to reflect for a moment upon a theological movement known as the Death of God movement. In many ways, it began with the philosophers in the 18th and 19th century, in particular Nietzsche. And there was a general recognition that not simply that the church had become marginalised in the West, but also the significance of God. Now, of course, in many ways, humankind was then deified, and there's a misplaced trust in human achievement or human progress. But nevertheless, there was a very powerful insight within philosophy about the displacement of God, about the figure of God had lost its currency. In the 20th century, in the 1960s, there was a group of theologians. You'd hardly call them a group. It's more a coincidence. A number of key theologians, Altizer, Van Buren and Hamilton, who perhaps in parallel started to reflect theologically about the death of God. And this took many forms. The essence of and this is my summary of this movement, is that following the Second World War, God, within theological circles, the figure of God had lost its currency, its value. In the Second World War, of course, there were at the least 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. And so the notion of a God who was at least loving and all-powerful just did not ring true. So after World War II, into the 50s and 60s, there was a earnest theological search within the academy, but also within churches. And there was a recognition that the God that we had inherited, God who was often portrayed as a king or judge, who ruled, who created communities in which obedience was prized, that this God had failed. And that really, in the light of the failure of this God, it was important for these theologians and others since then to proclaim the death of God, the death certainly of that kind of God that no longer speaks to human existence. Now, of course, within the life of the church and theological academies, there is a range of views or perspectives that we can adopt or take, but I still think that this movement, or that was generated by the death of God theology, is really important in this age, particularly in the West. The church in the West is generally on the decline, and it's not simply because people have lost interest in faith, but the church itself and this God who is king or judge, who has failed so many, has lost credibility. So there are all sorts of sociological changes taking place, which has led to people choosing not to belong to a church. But there's a profound theological failure that the God of the church has failed to speak to human existence, which brings us back to the cross, which brings us back to the importance of the cross. We know factually that the Jesus movement was perceived by the Romans as a threat. Historically, Jesus was crucified by the Romans using a Roman form of execution, that is the crucifixion, which was reserved for traitors or subversives. Jesus came preaching and practicing an inclusive community based on compassion, on empathy, that transcended traditional barriers, that broke the purity code, which questioned religious and political mores of the time. So, in a way, it was inevitable that he would clash with the authorities, and the ultimate authorities were Roman. Certainly they selected the chief priests or the chief tax collector, but the ultimate source of power was Roman, and all things were done in order to maintain the peace of Rome. So there was a certain inevitability about the fact that Jesus would meet his end in this way, that he would be crucified. And if we're looking at it historically, and I think too existentially, the cross is not then a joyous symbol. It's a symbol of failure. There's a bleakness about it. This is how the great cause of Jesus ended. It ended on the cross, a symbol of shame, of starkness. And there are a couple of things that flow from that. First of all, this image of the cross as this bleak symbol, this symbol that questions and challenges all things, acts as a critique of the history and the practices of the church. Historically, the church has been seduced by power. We in the church have been easily seduced by power and its trappings. Part and parcel of the institutional church has been a notion of entitlement. Our leaders have been conditioned, expecting themselves to be entitled or privileged. Now, the problem with entitlement is that, and I include myself in this, when we've been brought up in a culture and in a church which is within a culture where entitlement is like a birthright, we often don't see the fact that we are entitled until there's some kind of jarring experience from the outside, until we're confronted by some external force or presence or community, another person, another perspective. And it's often in those jarring moments we think, goodness me, my existence, my church, my culture is an entitled culture. So with that in mind, if the cross on Good Friday means anything, it calls into question any notion of entitlement or privilege. It pulls the mat out. It challenges entitlement in all its forms. The entitlement which is a source of abuse, whether that's in relationship to gender violence, misogyny or homophobia. The cross is a bleak symbol that calls into question all forms of entitlement. But at a more personal level, and that's where I'd like to focus now, I want us to return to those wonderful paintings of Clarice Beckett and reflect for a moment upon our own lives, our own journey. By now, most of us realise the complexity of human existence, the ambiguity of human relationships. Most of us have gone through various crises. Some of us have been jarred, and we've had to unlearn things like our own sense of entitlement or privilege. In some cases, we've been betrayed by others. We've perhaps had enormous experiences of loss or grief, and we're still grieving, we're still lamenting for lost things. All those things are part and parcel of what it means to be human. And if there's one day in the Christian calendar where humanity is honoured, it's really on Good Friday, that the complexities, the ambiguity of human existence is honoured on this day. So return to those extraordinary paintings of Clarice Beckett, the simplicity. Imagine it's morning, early in the morning, living not far from the beach. We can't see the water. We know it's over the horizon. And we decide to, in solitude, walk down to the beach. It's pre-dawn. The light is grey, perhaps a street light or two. And we begin that journey. And there's something about the silence, the space and the solitude which strips us bare. Ordinarily, that experience of being stripped bare can be disconcerting, but sometimes there's an honesty about it and it just feels right. That kind of experience is a Clarice Beckett experience. She invites us into the simplicity of life, into an experience where we are stripped bare. There are no defences. There are no facades. All is seen. It is stark human existence. But in that simplicity, in those paintings, in that experience, there is just a trace, a suggestion of light, of another possibility, another chapter, another way of doing or seeing things. It's not an answer. It's not all set out for us. It's just a hint or a trace. On Good Friday, as we reflect upon the significance of the cross, we do well to eschew and reject the privilege and entitlement of the church and our own society. We do well to place ourselves in a position where, like in a Beckett painting, we are stripped bare, because it is only in that context that we have, in a sense, a deep and profound sense of self-acceptance, but also we begin to discern a trace, a hint, the promise of something else. And while it's only a trace, it seems real, it's profound, and it suggests new possibilities. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer and Sustainer. Amen.